All right, welcome to the Week 1 Forum. As this is the first weekly forum, and as the forums comprise nearly 1/3 of students' overall grades, I want to make sure that you carefully review the assignment instructions concerning the forums. You need to look at the forum posting requirements as minimum requirements. In other words, if you make 5 total posts in a week, that may only be worth a C grade, depending on the quality of the posts, which would be about 14 out of 20 posts. Making a lot of substantive posts is the best way to ensure that you can earn the maximum number of points for a weekly forum. So make sure you put in the time. For this course, I want students to make 2 initial posts. Your first post should demonstrate that you've read chapter 1 of the textbook and that you can do that in a couple of different ways. First, by providing a brief summary of the chapter, which can be a time-consuming and somewhat rote way of demonstrating that you've learned something, but nevertheless that can be effective. Second, you can write about which aspect of the chapter most interested you, or which aspect of the chapter most surprised you, or which aspect of the chapter that you found most important, or which information in the chapter that you experienced the most difficulty understanding. Your second post should demonstrate that you've read about the country we'll be learning about this week, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Then you need to make a minimum of 4 posts over the course of the first week, until 11:55 p.m. Sunday, when the week 1 forum will close. And that means the 25th. So remember, you'll get out of these forums what you put into them. So if you work at it, you'll enjoy this a lot more. Each week we're going to have a country spotlighted for discussion, and you can find the relevant country on the course syllabus, and I'll talk about it in the videos, in the weekly videos. I expect students to make at least 1 substantive post on the designated country. By substantive, I mean, again, a brief summary of some aspect of the country profile provided in the text, or a summary with a link to a story, in the media reporting on events in that designated country. This week we're going to do the country profile in the United States, which is from page 558 to 573. Looking at that profile, this is a country you should be fairly familiar with, and it should give you some clues as to what I'm looking for in the forum discussions. And then later on, when we have country profiles to submit, written country profiles. So now that I've addressed the assignment expectations for the forums, I want to address some of the material in Chapter 1 and give you some guidance for the bulk of this week's discussion. I really like the author's approach to the issue of methodology, which is a 10-penny word meaning, how we go about practicing social science. The question here is, how do we know what we know? How can we be sure that the evidence that we are putting forward is accurate and that it means what we think it means? The authors state that how we go about asking questions and forming a research agenda is really important. And they illustrate that by discussing the old syllogism that I referenced in the overview. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. My principal dissertation director, this guy named Dr. Dan Sabia, was fond of dismissingly saying, "So what?" when one of his graduate students got too fond of hearing the sound of his or her own voice. That the kind of syllogism that you learn, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's a so what kind of question. Who cares? What does it really? What does that generate in terms of helping us to understand things? So what he was doing is trying to keep us on task. Djokovic and Eastwood argue that why questions produce far more information than who, what, where, and when questions. Those kinds of questions can produce some useful factual information, but why questions and how questions get to the heart of causality. And that's the sort of thing that most interests social scientists. Think about how the information you would need, to gather in order to formulate a good answer to the question, why did Christopher Columbus sail into the West, as opposed to who was Christopher Columbus? Or when did Christopher Columbus discover the New World? Those questions produce information, but not the depth of detail that a why question would produce. So what are the major research questions addressed by students of comparative politics? The field is predominantly concerned with issues related to international relations, So the broad area of research covered in Decovik and Eastwood are kind of laid out, right? Why did nation states become the principal unit of political organizations? What factors influence political and economic development? Why do some nations develop democratic political regimes while others adopt authoritarian political regimes? Why do nations go to war? Why do revolutions occur? Why does racism, misogyny, and other forms of discrimination persist? So how do we go about studying human behavior scientifically? And what role does science play in this process? What do we mean by science? First, we have to form hypotheses about the behavior we want to study. Say we're interested in understanding voting behavior. We call voting a variable, right? Which means it's a behavior that's likely to change when it interacts with some other factor. Now we want to understand how various independent variables, like levels of education, level of income, gender, levels of religiosity, and so on. How do these sorts of variables influence the likelihood of people voting? The independent variable is what we think is likely to generate a change in the dependent variable. Now, we can say with a fair amount of confidence that people with college and postgraduate educations are more likely to vote. But we cannot simply declare college causes people to vote, right? We are social scientists, not priests, and so we don't make absolute declarations of certainty. Rather, we tentatively deduce that the evidence points us in a direction, right? One important attribute of science should be humility and a willingness to be persuaded and guided by the accumulation of evidence. Comparison plays an important role in the social sciences. The text discusses the advantages and disadvantages of most similar systems comparisons and most different systems comparisons. I'll briefly use an example from American politics. Say you want to study the effectiveness of educational systems at the state level. If you wanted to evaluate the effectiveness of Oklahoma's primary education system, which of the 50 states would you want to compare it to if you wanted to use a most similar systems approach? Which states, have a similar population and a similar per capita income? Kentucky, South Carolina, maybe one or two other states. Which states would you want to put in a most different systems approach? Obviously, you'd want the very big states like California and New York, and then you'd want the really small states like Wyoming and Montana and South Dakota. So, as I noted earlier, an important part of these forums are going to be picking a country each week for discussion. I want you to read the country profile in the text, and then I expect you to make a good initial post demonstrating to me that you've informed yourself regarding the country selected. And I want to see the discussion of how the government and politics of that country differs from your experience as Americans. And again, as I said, this week we're reading the profile of the United States so that we'll have a factual baseline. What did you learn about this country that you may not have learned in high school or in your American federal government course? Okay, this has gone long enough. Hopefully I've given you plenty of guidance as to how to do your reading and what to do in terms of participating in the forum. Let's have a great week, and if you have anything that you don't understand, please feel free to ask a question in the forum. If I see it, I will try to help you out.